A millionaire CEO discovered his maid's daughter hiding in his kitchen, trembling over a plate of cold scraps. And the choice he made in that single moment would crack open a heart that wealth had sealed shut for years. In a house where marble gleams brighter than mercy, silence has a price. 8-year-old Amira Robinson knew that hunger didn't wait for permission. She crouched in the shadows of a millionaire's kitchen, chasing leftovers destined for the compost bin, because an empty stomach doesn't understand the rules of polished granite and copper pans. But when the man who controlled everything walked through that door and found the child who owned nothing, one moment of raw need would shatter the illusion of order he'd spent his life building. Behind the spotless counters and orchestrated perfection lay a corruption neither of them was ready to face. This isn't just a story about a maid's daughter caught eating scraps. It's the story of how one child's hunger awakened the conscience of a man who'd forgotten what it meant to feel. And before we go any further, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. Now, let's begin. An 8-year-old girl knew that the sound of expensive shoes on marble was the countdown to disaster. Amira Robinson pressed her small body against the cold steel of the walk-in pantry, her breath shallow and measured. Just 10 more seconds, she prayed. Just let the footsteps pass. The kitchen in Mr. Langston's mansion was larger than any place she'd ever lived. It was a cathedral of order. Polished wood cabinets that stretched to the ceiling, copper pots hanging like ornaments, and granite countertops so cold they made her shiver when she touched them. Amira was small for her age, with tight braids pulled back in a faded red ribbon, and she had memorized every corner of this room. She'd studied it the way other children studied maps. Night after night, while her mother worked herself to exhaustion, Amira had learned where the shadows fell deepest. Her mother, Amber Robinson, was a maid here. She was the woman who scrubbed floors until they reflected light like mirrors, who polished silver until her hands cracked, who disappeared into the walls of this house as if she were invisible. Tonight, Amber was 3 floors up, turning down beds in guest rooms that no one ever slept in. She would be bone-tired. Her knees would ache. That cough she tried to muffle into her sleeve would be rattling her chest again. Amira's stomach twisted with a sharp, hollow pain. It was 6:47 a.m. She had counted the seconds. The kitchen door swung shut. Silence settled like dust. Amira counted to 60, her lips forming the numbers without sound. Then she slipped from behind the pantry door. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool tile. She moved past the 8-burner stove, past the marble island big enough to seat 12. Her eyes locked on the stainless steel counter near the back exit, the discard station. Mr. Langston's head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, was strict about waste. Every scrap of uneaten food was to be cleared by 7 a.m. sharp. But the night cook, Maria, was kind. She would leave things: half a roasted chicken, a bowl of soup gone cold, the heel of fresh bread, loosely covered on the counter for an extra 20 minutes, as if she'd simply forgotten. She never forgot. Amira's hands trembled as she saw it. A white ceramic plate with cold spaghetti, the red sauce dried around the edges. It was from last night's staff dinner. Her mouth watered so violently it hurt. There was also a bread roll, hard as stone but still edible. She reached for the plate. The pasta was ice cold. She didn't care. She lifted a forkful toward her mouth, her fingers shaking. A shadow fell across the counter. The overhead lights blazed to life. Amira's entire body went rigid. The fork slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. Spaghetti scattered across the pristine white tile like evidence of a crime. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, dressed impeccably in a navy suit and crimson tie, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His face was sharp, unreadable, and his eyes, gray as winter storms, looked as though they hadn't softened in years. It was Richard Langston, the man who owned this house. The man who owned the company her mother worked for. The man her mother had warned her with desperate urgency must never, ever be disturbed. Amira couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape. She was caught. Richard Langston stood frozen in the doorway, his leather briefcase still in his hand, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A child, in his kitchen, at dawn, eating garbage. Richard's voice came out quieter than he intended. "Where is your mother?" Amira's eyes filled with tears. Her lips trembled, but no words came. She looked like a cornered animal, small and defenseless, waiting for a blow that never landed. "Amira?" The voice came from behind him, breathless, horrified. Richard turned. Amber Robinson stood in the service hallway, still clutching a dust cloth in one hand. Her uniform, a plain gray dress that had seen too many washes, hung loose on her thin frame. Her face drained of color as she took in the scene. Her daughter frozen by the counter, pasta scattered across the floor. Her employer standing between them like a judge. "Please," Amber whispered, rushing forward. She dropped to her knees and began gathering the spaghetti with her bare hands, her movements frantic. "Please, sir, she didn't mean any harm." "I'll clean this up. I'll pay for the food. Stop." Richard's command was gentle but firm. Amber froze, her hands hovering over the tile. Slowly, she looked up at him, and Richard saw something that made his chest tighten, raw, unfiltered terror. Not of violence, of loss, of the fragile thread that held her life together snapping in his hands. "Stand up," he said. She obeyed, rising on shaking legs. Amira rushed to her mother's side, burying her face in Amber's hip. Amber's hand instinctively went to her daughter's head, protective even in her own fear. Richard studied them both. Amber's hands, the ones still clutching bits of cold pasta, were cracked and blistered. The skin around her knuckles was raw, split open in places. He'd never noticed before. He'd never looked. "How long has she been hungry?" he asked. Amber's throat worked. "Sir, it won't happen again. I'll make sure she stays home. That wasn't what I asked." A tear slid down Amber's cheek. "She's not hungry, sir. Children don't always understand. Don't lie to me." Richard's tone wasn't cruel, but it cut through her excuse like a blade. "How long?" Amber's composure shattered. Her shoulders shook. "A few weeks," she whispered. "Maybe longer." I don't always know when she's eaten at school." Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. He glanced at Amira, who was watching him with wide, haunted eyes, the eyes of a child who'd learned too young that adults couldn't always be trusted to help. "Take her home," he said finally. "We'll discuss this later." Amber nodded rapidly, pulling Amira toward the door. "Thank you, sir. Thank you." "It won't—" "Amber." Richard's voice stopped her at the threshold. "Come to my study at 4 o'clock, alone." The color drained from her face again, but she nodded. Richard couldn't concentrate on his morning calls. The image of Amira's trembling hands kept surfacing in his mind, unwanted and persistent. By noon, he'd abandoned his desk and found himself walking the house, something he rarely did. The mansion felt different suddenly, larger, colder. As he passed the butler's pantry, he heard voices. "Honestly think Mr. Langston cares?" Tony Gardner's smug baritone carried through the cracked door. "She's lucky she still has a job. A charity case like that should be grateful." Laughter followed. Richard's jaw tightened. "Heard Chen's cutting her hours again next month," another voice added. "Something about budget adjustments." "Budget adjustments." Tony snorted. "Right. More like she's not worth the full wage." Richard pushed the door open. 3 men stood around the counter. Tony Gardner, his head butler, Jeremy Haynes, chief of security, and Edward Wallace, the household accountant. They snapped to attention, faces smoothing into professional masks. "Gentlemen," Richard said coldly. "Don't let me interrupt." Tony recovered first, offering a practiced smile. "Mr. Langston, I heard what you were doing." Richard's gaze moved between them, sharp as broken glass. "Get back to work." They scattered like roaches. At 4 o'clock, Amber knocked on his study door. She looked even smaller in the vast, book-lined room. Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. She perched on its edge, hands folded tightly in her lap. "Tell me about the deductions," Richard said without preamble. Amber's eyes widened. "Sir, Your wages. You said there have been deductions. Explain." Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, Richard thought she might refuse. Then, quietly, as if confessing a sin, "Mr. Wallace said there were damages, broken items, extra cleaning supplies. He takes it from my pay each month. What items?" I don't know, sir." "He doesn't always say." Richard leaned back in his chair. "And the bag searches?" Amber flinched. "Mr. Haynes, every Friday. He says it's protocol, to make sure nothing's taken." "Has anything ever been taken?" "No, sir. Never." Richard studied her, the way she couldn't meet his eyes, the way her fingers worried at a loose thread on her uniform. Shame radiated from her like heat. "Why didn't you report this to me?" Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, desperate. "Because I can't lose this job, Mr. Langston. I can't. Amira needs—" Her voice broke. "Please don't fire me. I'll work twice as hard. I'm not firing you." The words seemed to take a moment to land. Amber blinked, confused. "I'm going to look into this," Richard continued. "But I need you to be honest with me. All of it. Everything they've done." Amber's face crumpled. "Please don't. They'll make it worse." They'll what?" She closed her eyes. "They'll find a reason to let me go. They always do. I've seen it happen to others." Richard felt anger, clean, sharp, clarifying, cut through the fog of his ignorance. On the corner of his desk sat a pair of torn cleaning gloves, left there by mistake during yesterday's dusting. He picked them up, turning them over in his hands. The fabric was worn through at the fingertips, stained with chemicals. "Are these yours?" he asked. Amber nodded, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I must have forgotten. How long have you been wearing them?" "A few months. Mr. Wallace said new ones weren't in the budget." Richard set the gloves down carefully, his decision crystallizing. "Go home, Amber. Take tomorrow off. Paid." "Sir, I can't." "You can. You will." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "And Amber? Don't worry about Gardner, Wallace, or Haynes. Leave them to me." She rose unsteadily, nodded once, and left. Richard walked to the window. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Through the sheets of water, he watched Amber and Amira hurry toward the service gate, huddled under a single thin jacket. They disappeared into the gray afternoon, two shadows swallowed by the storm. He looked back at the torn gloves on his desk. His house had never felt dirtier. Richard didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amira's trembling hands reaching for cold pasta. He saw Amber's cracked knuckles, the torn gloves, the way she'd flinched when he'd asked about the deductions, as if truth itself were dangerous. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He called his personal attorney at 6 a.m. "Marcus, I need a forensic audit of my household accounts, every transaction for the past 2 years, and I need it done quietly." There was a pause. "Richard, is everything—" "Just do it. I'll send over the access codes within the hour." 3 days later, the report arrived in a sealed envelope. Richard dismissed his assistant, locked his study door, and opened it. The first page was a summary. The second page made his blood run cold. By the fifth page, his hands were shaking with rage. Edward Wallace had been stealing for 18 months. The numbers were staggering. Falsified repair invoices, $47,000 for a roof that was never fixed. Inflated maintenance contracts, $23,000 for landscaping work that was done by the regular groundskeeper. Phantom supplier charges, $31,000 for cleaning supplies that were never ordered. Over and over, systematic theft disguised as operational expenses. But it wasn't just Wallace. Embedded in the report were email threads, cross-reference transactions, and security logs that painted a damning picture. Tony Gardner had approved fraudulent invoices without question. Jeremy Haynes had deleted surveillance footage from storage rooms where cash and supplies were kept. They'd built an entire system of corruption, and they'd done it in plain sight, confident that Richard would never look closely enough to notice. The final section of the audit detailed payroll irregularities. Amber Robinson's wages had been reduced 7 times in 14 months. Each time, Edward Wallace had coded it as disciplinary adjustment or damage reimbursement. There were no incident reports, no documentation, just deductions that carved away at an already meager salary until she was earning barely above minimum wage. Other household staff had similar patterns, small cuts, unexplained fees, wages that mysteriously shrank month after month while Wallace's administrative bonuses grew. Richard set the report down, his hands curling into fists. The memories came unbidden, fragments he'd been too blind to see as patterns. 6 months ago, Amber arriving early, staying late, moving through rooms like a ghost. Tony Gardner's voice in the hallway. "If you can't handle the workload, Robinson, there are plenty of others who can." 4 months ago, Jeremy Haynes stopped Amber at the service entrance, making her empty her bag onto the table while other staff watched. The humiliation on her face, his own irritation at the disruption, never asking why it was happening. 2 months ago, passing the kitchen and hearing whispers, ungrateful, lazy, taking advantage. He'd dismissed it as staff drama beneath his concern. How many times had Amber stood in front of these men, powerless and afraid, while Richard sat in his study reviewing profit margins and acquisition deals? How many nights had Amira gone to bed hungry while he dined alone on meals he barely touched? The shame of it crushed him. That night, Richard walked the empty halls of his mansion. The storm that had started days ago still raged outside, rain lashing against windows, wind howling through the eaves. The house felt hollow, each room a monument to wealth without warmth. He found himself standing in the great hall, staring at a portrait of his late wife, Catherine. She died 3 years ago. Cancer, swift and merciless. In the painting, she smiled with the kind of genuine joy he hadn't felt since her passing. He remembered her voice, soft but unwavering, during one of their last conversations. They'd been arguing about his workaholic tendencies, his emotional distance from the household staff. "Richard," she'd said, "you can own the finest house in the city, but if there's no kindness in it, you're just a man living in an expensive tomb. A house isn't rich if kindness is poor." He'd dismissed it then, too consumed by business, by the need to build and acquire and control. Now her words echoed in the silence like an indictment. Thunder rumbled overhead. Lightning illuminated the hall in stark white flashes. Richard looked down at the audit report still clutched in his hand. The evidence was irrefutable. The betrayal was complete. But what haunted him most wasn't Wallace's greed or Gardner's cruelty. It was his own willful ignorance. He'd built an empire on ruthless efficiency and calculated risk. He'd prided himself on seeing through deception in boardrooms, on reading people, on staying 3 steps ahead. Yet in his own home, under his own roof, his most vulnerable employee had been systematically brutalized. And he'd noticed nothing, because he hadn't wanted to see, because Amber Robinson was invisible to him in the way that all servants were invisible, furniture that moved and cleaned and required no thought beyond their function. The realization disgusted him. Richard walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Outside, the storm turned the grounds into a blur of darkness and rain. Somewhere beyond these walls, Amber and Amira were trying to survive on scraps while the men he'd trusted robbed them blind. He thought of Amira's eyes, wide, frightened, but still defiant. She'd been stealing not out of malice, but out of desperation. And even in her hunger, she'd looked at him with something he didn't deserve: hope. Richard's jaw tightened. His reflection in the rain-streaked glass looked older, harder, but for the first time in years, awake. "Not anymore," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of an oath. "Tomorrow, there will be a reckoning." Tonight, the storm raged on. Richard summoned them at dawn. The message was brief, delivered by his personal assistant to each man's quarters. Great Hall. 6 a.m., mandatory. No explanation. No room for refusal. When Tony Gardner, Edward Wallace, and Jeremy Haynes arrived, they found Richard standing at the head of the long mahogany table, backlit by the gray morning light filtering through tall windows. The audit folder lay open before him like evidence at a trial, and trembling by the doorway, clutching her worn jacket, stood Amber Robinson. Tony's eyes narrowed. "Sir, if this is about the Robinson matter, I can assure you—" "Sit down." Richard's voice was ice. The 3 men exchanged glances but obeyed, settling into chairs across from him. Jeremy crossed his arms, defiant. Edward's fingers drummed nervously on the table. Tony maintained his practiced composure, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. Richard let the silence stretch, watching them. Then he spoke. 18 months, he said quietly. "That's how long you've been stealing from me." Edward's face went pale. "Sir, I don't know what you've been told, but—" $47,000 for a roof repair that never happened. Richard's finger traced a line down the page. $23,000 for landscaping work done by my existing staff. $31,000 for supplies that were never ordered. He looked up. "Should I continue?" "There must be some mistake," Tony interjected smoothly. "Accounting errors happen. If you'll allow us to review—" "There's no mistake." Richard slid a stack of papers across the table. "Forged invoices, doctored payroll records, deleted security footage. It's all here." Jeremy leaned forward, his voice hard. "You had us investigated? Without cause? That's cause?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "I found a child eating garbage in my kitchen because you 3 have been robbing her mother blind for over a year." "That's the cause." Edward found his voice scrambling. The deductions were legitimate. Broken items, damages, name one. Richard's eyes locked on him. Name a single item Amber Robinson broke. Silence. You can't, Richard continued, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. Because there weren't any. You invented charges. You cut her wages 7 times. You humiliated her. He turned to Jeremy. You searched her bag every week. Made her empty her pockets in front of the other staff. While she starved in my home. Jeremy's jaw clenched. That's protocol. Security measures for what? What did you ever find? That's not the point. That's exactly the point. Richard stood, his shadow falling across the table. You turned this house into a prison for the people who keep it running. And you did it because you thought I'd never notice. That I'd never care. Edward's composure cracked. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a checkbook. Mr. Langston, let's be reasonable. I can make restitution. Full repayment plus interest. We can settle this quietly. You think this is about money? Tony shifted tactics, his voice turning accusatory. Sir, with all respect, you're taking the word of a maid over your senior staff. She's been known to exaggerate to... Careful. Richard's voice cut like a blade. I'm only saying, Tony pressed, that people in her position often fabricate grievances. She's looking for a payout. She asked for nothing. Richard's words landed like stones. She begged me not to investigate because she was terrified of losing the job you 3 were already using to abuse her. Jeremy stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. This is absurd. You're going to believe some sob story over men who've served you for years? Fine. My lawyer will be in touch. Wrongful termination. Defamation. Sit down. Something in Richard's tone made Jeremy freeze. You'll leave this house before the sun sets, Richard said, his voice deadly quiet. All 3 of you. Security will escort you. If you attempt to contact any member of my staff, if you speak to the press, if you drive past this property, I will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. The evidence is already with my attorneys. You can't, Edward started. I own this house. I own the company that employs you. I can do whatever I want. Richard's gaze swept over them. You're done here. For a moment, no one moved. Then Tony stood slowly, his mask finally slipping to reveal cold fury. You'll regret this. No, Richard said. I regret not doing it sooner. He pressed a button on the desk. 2 security officers appeared at the door. Not Jeremy's men, but external professionals Richard had hired overnight. Escort them out. Make sure they take nothing but their personal effects. As the 3 men were led away, Edward pale and shaking, Tony rigid with impotent rage, Jeremy still muttering threats, Richard finally turned to Amber. She stood frozen by the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face. Her shoulders shook with sobs she'd been holding back for months, maybe years. Richard crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. Amber, he said softly, I owe you more than an apology. That evening, Richard found himself drawn back to the kitchen, the place where everything had begun. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, despite the weight of what had transpired. The corrupt men were gone, their rooms already being cleared. But the silence that remained wasn't the cold, oppressive quiet he'd grown accustomed to. It was the silence of possibility. He pushed open the kitchen door and stopped. Amira sat on the floor in the corner, knees tucked under her chin, a stubby pencil moving across a piece of scrap paper. She wasn't hiding this time, just existing in the space, small and focused, lost in whatever world she was creating on that page. Richard's throat tightened. She looked so young, so impossibly fragile. He'd stopped by the kitchen earlier and asked Maria, the night cook, to prepare a proper meal. Nothing fancy, just warm and filling. Now he carried the tray carefully, kneeling down beside Amira with a soft grunt that betrayed how long it had been since he'd sat on the floor. Amira looked up, startled. Her eyes went wide. It's okay, Richard said gently. He set the tray down between them. Spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, a glass of milk. Steam rose from the plate. You don't have to hide anymore. Amira stared at the food, then at him, confusion and disbelief warring on her face. Is this for me? It is. Richard gestured to the small servants' table against the wall, the one the staff used during their breaks. But I was thinking, maybe we could sit there, together? For a long moment, Amira didn't move. Then, slowly, she unfolded herself and climbed onto one of the chairs. Richard settled across from her, the wooden seat creaking under his weight. It felt strange, sitting here in his $1,000 suit at a table that had probably cost $50. But somehow it felt more real than any boardroom he'd ever occupied. Amira picked up her fork tentatively, took a bite, and her whole face transformed. She ate slowly at first, then with more confidence. "Mr. Langston?" Her voice was small. "Yes? Do rich people ever eat spaghetti too?" The question was so earnest, so achingly innocent, that Richard felt something crack open in his chest. A laugh escaped him, genuine, unguarded, rusty from disuse. "Yes," he said, smiling. "Yes, we do. Though I think yours might taste better than mine usually does." Amira giggled, a sound like wind chimes. They ate in comfortable silence, and Richard found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. No performance, no armor. Just a meal shared with a child who deserved so much more than the world had given her. Movement caught his eye. Amber stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears glistening on her cheeks. But she wasn't crying from pain anymore. This was something else, relief, gratitude, disbelief that kindness could be real. Their eyes met. Richard nodded once, and Amber nodded back, a wordless understanding passing between them. When Amira finished eating, she looked up at him with something approaching trust. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. You're welcome." Amira. As she slipped down from the chair and ran to her mother's arms, Richard sat alone at the servants' table, staring at the empty plate. His chest felt full in a way he couldn't name. Warm. Alive. He whispered to the empty kitchen, his voice barely audible. "Maybe this is what family feels like." Outside, the first stars appeared through the window. Inside, something broken had begun to heal. The next morning, Richard sat in his study with Marcus, his attorney, and laid out a plan that would have seemed impossible a week ago. "I want to establish a trust," he said, sliding a handwritten outline across the desk. "The Robinson-Langston Initiative, a fund for domestic workers and single mothers. Education, healthcare, legal assistance, emergency relief." Marcus studied the numbers, his eyebrows climbing. "Richard, this is substantial." "It needs to be." Richard's voice was firm. "And I want Amber Robinson's wages restored, every cent that was stolen plus interest. Pay off her debts. Set up an education fund for her daughter. Consider it done." Within 48 hours, the news leaked. A disgruntled Edward Wallace, desperate to salvage his reputation, had gone to the press with a twisted version of events. But the truth, backed by Richard's audit and his attorney's statements, painted a very different picture. The headlines exploded. CEO exposes corruption in own home. Millionaire fires senior staff over Maid's treatment. Langston launches foundation after discovering employee. Abuse. Richard's publicist called in a panic, begging for damage control. Richard declined every interview request, but one. Standing outside his home, facing a cluster of cameras, he spoke plainly. "This isn't charity," he said, his voice steady. "It's a correction. For too long, I allowed people in positions of power to abuse those who had none. That ends now. The Robinson-Langston Initiative exists because justice delayed is still worth pursuing." He refused to elaborate further, walking back inside while questions erupted behind him. 3 weeks later, the foundation held its first official meeting in the Great Hall, the same room where Richard had fired the men who'd corrupted his household. Now it was filled with social workers, legal advocates, and community organizers. And at the podium stood Amber Robinson. She wore a simple navy dress, her hands no longer cracked and raw but still trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the lectern. The room fell silent. "I spent years invisible," Amber began, her voice quiet but growing stronger with each word. "I cleaned floors that no one noticed. I worked nights that no one counted. And when I suffered, I stayed silent because silence felt safer than risk." She paused, her eyes finding Richard in the back row. "But silence protects cruelty. It lets injustice thrive in the shadows." Her voice broke, then steadied. What happened here, what Mr. Langston did, wasn't just about money or jobs. It was about being seen, being believed, being treated as human. Tears glistened on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "Forgiveness doesn't erase pain," she said. "But kindness can rebuild what cruelty tried to destroy. And if this foundation can help even one person feel less invisible, then maybe something good can come from all that hurt." The room erupted in applause. Amber stepped down, overwhelmed, and Richard met her halfway. shaking her hand with genuine respect. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed, Amber appeared at Richard's study door, holding something wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted to give you this," she said softly. Richard unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a simple wooden frame holding two photographs side by side, one of his late wife Catherine, smiling in the garden, and one of Amira, laughing in that same garden just last week. The juxtaposition struck him silent. Past and present, loss and hope, the woman he'd loved and the child who'd reminded him how to feel. Catherine would have liked Amira, Richard whispered. Amber nodded. "And Amira already looks up to you like, well, like family." Richard traced the edge of Catherine's photo, then Amira's, his vision blurring. "Thank you, Amber, for everything." "No, sir," she said gently. "Thank you." As she left, Richard placed the frame on his desk where he'd see it every morning, a bridge between grief and grace, a reminder that even broken things could be made whole again. 6 months later, Langston Manor had transformed in ways that couldn't be measured in marble or money. Laughter echoed through hallways that had known only footsteps and whispers. The kitchen, once a sterile showroom, now hummed with life. Maria the cook taught Amira how to make cookies on Saturday mornings. The new household staff, hired under fair contracts with transparent wages, gathered around the servants' table for meals that felt less like obligations and more like family dinners. Amira thrived at Riverside Academy, a private school where her scholarship had raised eyebrows until Richard made it clear that merit, not pedigree, had earned her the seat. She came home each afternoon bursting with stories about books she'd read, friends she'd made, a world that was finally opening to her. Amber had blossomed, too. As the Foundation's director of operations, she moved through the mansion with quiet confidence, no longer invisible, but essential. She wore professional clothes now, spoke at community meetings, and carried herself like someone who'd remembered, or perhaps discovered for the first time, her own worth. And Richard was a different man. He left the office earlier. He asked questions instead of issuing commands. He sat in the kitchen some evenings, drinking coffee and listening to Amira practice her multiplication tables. The empire he'd built still ran efficiently, but it no longer consumed him. He'd found something he'd thought lost forever, purpose that wasn't measured in profit margins. On Amira's 10th birthday, Richard hosted a small celebration in the garden, nothing extravagant, just cake and streamers and the people who'd come to matter. After the candles were blown out and the presents opened, Amira approached him with something hidden behind her back. "I made this for you," she said shyly. She handed him a drawing on thick white paper, the kind her art teacher had given her for special projects. Richard unfolded it carefully. The image was simple but rendered with surprising detail. A kitchen drawn in colored pencil, 2 chairs at a small table, a plate of spaghetti between them. A tall man with silver hair sat across from a small girl with braids. Both were smiling. Light poured through a window, golden and warm. "It's us," Amira said, her voice soft. "The day everything got better." Richard's throat closed. He knelt down so he was eye level with her. This remarkable child who'd saved him as much as he'd saved her. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me," he said honestly. Amira beamed. "Really?" "Really." That evening, after the guests had left and Amber had taken Amira home to their new apartment, modest but theirs, paid for and safe, Richard sat in his study with the drawing and a brass engraving plate. He worked carefully, etching 3 words beneath the image in precise capital letters, "Never again silent." He hung the framed piece in the great hall the next morning, right beside Catherine's portrait. The 2 images side by side felt right, a bridge between who he'd been and who he was becoming. Weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Richard found himself standing in the kitchen where it had all begun. Sunlight streamed through the windows, washing the floor in gold. The copper pots gleamed. The granite counters sparkled, but the room was no longer cold. Maria hummed while preparing breakfast. 2 staff members chatted quietly over coffee at the table where Richard and Amira had shared their first meal. Somewhere upstairs, he could hear Amber's voice on a phone call, confident and clear, coordinating a Foundation event. Richard poured himself coffee and sat at that same servants' table, the wood warm under his hands. He thought about the terrified child who'd crouched on this floor 6 months ago, eating scraps because hunger didn't follow rules. He thought about the man he'd been, successful, powerful, and utterly hollow. He thought about Catherine's words, "A house isn't rich if kindness is poor." Now finally he understood. The mansion was still grand. The business was still thriving. But those things no longer defined wealth. Wealth was Amira's laughter ringing through the halls. It was Amber walking with her head high. It was staff who felt valued, protected, and seen. It was the foundation helping dozens of families find dignity. It was the weight that had lifted from his own chest, replaced by something lighter and infinitely more precious. Richard smiled into his coffee as morning light filled the kitchen. In the end, it wasn't the mansion that became rich, it was the hearts inside it.